It might be you.
Okay. All right. So thank you all for coming to hear this final talk in the series of lectures on human devolution. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, is it visible? Okay, thank you. So I thank the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies for inviting me to give these presentations on my book, Human Devolution, a Vedic Alternative to Darwin's Theory. And in these talks, I've tried to include a discussion of the text, its impact at the time, and its current relevance, if any. So just to review where we've gone over the past couple of months as we've gone through the different chapters of the book. First, we considered the question in Western context, because although the presentation has its roots in the Vedic cosmology of the Srimad Bhagavatam and other Puranas, it's being presented in a Western context or a context influenced by science as it's developed over the past couple of centuries, principally in the Western world. The first step after introducing the topic was to establish the need for an alternative to the present dominant theories. So in doing that, evidence was presented from different fields, including archaeology, genetics, and other areas that show there is room for an alternative. And in terms of presenting an alternative, I began with an example from, again, the West, Alfred Russel Wallace, who presented a non-material alternative to the Darwinian theory of evolution, of which he was the co-founder. And he proposed an alternative that includes a different ontology, including the spiritual aspect and the what is sometimes called the paranormal aspect. So next, in a couple of chapters of Human Devolution, I reviewed modern scientific evidence showing that human beings are not simply a combination of the chemical elements, ordinary matter, but also include a subtle mind element and a non-material conscious self. And this led to the idea that the cosmos is a multi-level cosmos with levels of mind, matter, and pure consciousness or spirit inhabited by conscious entities adapted to the conditions at each level. And bringing it back to the question of the origin of species, presented the idea that beings at the higher levels of this multi-level cosmos can modify and produce the biological forms on the lower levels. And we added to that the observation that the universe appears finely tuned for this to happen. So I think that anyone who delves into the question of the ultimate origin of life will have to, from a Vedic perspective, will have to ultimately deal with all of these various topics. So human devolution, a Vedic alternative to Darwin's theory, is one person's attempt to do that. But I see that all of the issues raised about the origin of life, the origin of the universe, all of these questions, the nature and origin of consciousness, are still matters of active discussion in the academic and scientific worlds, and that there is room for alternatives to be presented. So today, we're dealing with chapter 11, which is the final chapter of Human Devolution. It's called Human Devolution, a Vedic Account. And I call it a Vedic account because I realized there's not just one type of presentation that could be made based on study of the Vedic cosmological literature, primarily the Puranas. So this is not the only such account that could be given, but it's one. So in chapter 11, in its concluding paragraphs, I wrote pages 489 to 490. My thought in writing this book was that if the Vedic account of human origins were to be accepted as true, then there should be some correspondence between that account and the evidence available to us through our senses. I have shown, I believe, that such a correspondence does exist, and my hope is that this should generate interest in the Vedic literatures among scientists and the general public. And as I've tried to show throughout these talks, that wish became true. There was interest expressed among scientists and other academics in their professional literature about this topic. One example is the extensive treatment that C. Mackenzie Brown gave to human devolution in his works. And I'll let him introduce this final chapter. He notes in this publication, Cremo provides an extensive and thoroughly researched catalog of alien abductions, seances, paranormal apparitions, psychokinesis, and the like. It is all here. So here he's referring to previous chapters where, in order to justify positing a subtle material mind element with unusual powers, I introduced these topics. Now he goes on to say, the remainder of this review, however, will not rehearse the standard skeptic arguments against such, but will rather focus on what is by far the most creative and imaginative part of human devolution, its concluding chapter on the Vedic theory of human devolution. So that is what we're talking about today, that final chapter. So this chapter has to be understood in terms of a wider vision of the Vedic cosmology, which, as I said, involves a multi-level cosmos consisting of, to put it in the most simple terms, a level of pure consciousness or spirit, a level of subtle matter, composed of mental and intellectual and egoistical energies, and finally a level of the gross material elements with beings adapted to the conditions at the different levels. At the topmost level, we have a source of all conscious, personal, individual entities. And that those conscious, personal, individual entities, they can remain at that level, or we could say that is the level where they naturally belong. And some of them go down to the level of the subtle material energies, and they remain at that level. And among them is the first entity in the material level of reality, subtle and gross, which is Brahma, who is responsible for generating the gross and subtle material bodies that conscious selves that descend to this level occupy. He is assisted by entities called Prajapatis, generators of bodies. And these Prajapatis generate bodies of composed of the gross and subtle material elements for living entities that exist on the level of the gross material elements, including human beings. So the way that they do that is through a process of reproduction. It's described several places in the Puranas and the teachings of the Acharyas, how, for example, the daughters of the Prajapati Daksha, by their reproductive activities with other Prajapatis, generate the forms, the physical forms of human bodies, plant bodies, animal bodies. In other words, they can generate bodies unlike their own, different from their own. And there is some parallel to this in modern biology. It involves interspecies embryo transfer, whereby a female of one species can give birth to an offspring of a different species. This happens, for example, with this mother Elon and her offspring, a bongo calf, which is a different species altogether. So this process is what I would call devolution. And C. Mackenzie Brown put it this way: in simplified terms, from the Vedic view as interpreted by Primo, we begin as pure beings or units of consciousness in harmonious relationship with God, Krishna. And when we forget our original nature, we descend, devolve into physical bodies created by the demigods and demigoddesses. The demi-deities, by mysterious reproductive processes involving the sort of paranormal production of body parts and materializations of apparitional forms that Primo argues for in a preceding chapter, produce the originals of the various living species on our planet, including humans, who from then on normally reproduce in the usual sexual way. So I think it's very good that C. Mackenzie Brown accurately summarized what I said in this chapter, and that this is recorded in the academic literature, which is what I was trying to do, introduce these ideas into the discourse of different disciplines that are concerned with science and religion, biology, philosophy of science, history of science. So the other chapter that he refers to, he's referring to a previous chapter. That was chapter 9, which we talked about in 2 sessions ago, I believe. It was entitled Paranormal Modification and Production of Biological Form. And in that chapter, I cited scientific reports on laboratory demonstrations of mental influence on microorganisms, scientifically documented cases of miraculous healing, the work of Ian Stevenson on birthmarks related to wounds inflicted during a previous life, and reports by scientists such as Alfred Russel Wallace, who have observed mediums producing limbs or bodies of biological nature. So Brown accurately states that I invoke a what he called mysterious kind of reproductive activity. And this reproductive activity involves the use of glands for bodies that pre-exist. In the Vedic literature and the Puranas and the teachings of different acharyas, they're referred to as bijas or seeds. And Sadhguru Richard Thompson proposed that there's an analogy for this in Western thought. The rational seeds or the logos spermatikoi that philosophers like St. Augustine and Plotinus invoked in their accounts of the origin of species. Again, C. Mackenzie Brown noted, Primo notes the difficulty in explaining how in a fertilized egg, all the identical daughter cells, all with the same DNA, can differentiate into the different kinds of cells to form the various tissues present in the adult organism. Primo's Vedic alternative is to propose that each egg has not only its own particular DNA, but also a special bija, or subtle mantric seed, that comes directly from Krishna, the original seed of all beings and the seed-giving father of all. So in the Srimad Bhagavatam or Bhagavad Purana, in the chapters about Brahma, the first created being, the first demigod, producing the various kinds of bodily vehicles that souls on the material level of reality will occupy, mentions that he's not inventing anything. He's making use of pre-existing body plans that come ultimately from God, from Krishna personally, that have always existed. So in that sense, we're not creationists in the sense that these beaches or seeds or plans for different types of bodily vehicles that souls or conscious selves who come to the material level of reality occupy. These have always existed and they're used again and again and again in the different cycles of manifestation and non-manifestation of universes that take place. And neither can we say it's intelligent design because Brahma doesn't design these plans that exist. They pre-exist. They've always existed. So there are actually two kinds of seeds that are involved in this process. One would be the seed that represents the conscious self, the Atma, the soul, which gives consciousness and energizes the gross and subtle material elements that form the material body. And then the second type of seed is the subtle material template for that body. That is to say, the developmental body plan, because as was mentioned, each body begins as a fertilized egg, a single cell, and it begins to split. And each cell that divides as a result of this splitting contains the exact same DNA. So, how does each cell, as the process goes on, 2, 4, 8, 16, thousands, millions, trillions of cells in each human body, how does each cell know what part to play in becoming bone or muscle or a red blood cell or a neuron in the brain? How does it know to do that? So that is an unsolved problem in science. They're working on it. They have different proposals and ideas, but there's no complete mapped out explanation of how it happens. So I'm proposing these seeds as part of the process. And how are the seeds delivered? There are some hints in the Puranas about how this takes place. Apparently, the Prajapatis can take on different forms themselves. For example, there are descriptions in the Srimad Bhagavatam and Mahabharata how sages can take the form of animals like deer and engage in reproductive activity in those bodies. So they make use of these subtle seeds in that process. That's the proposal. And produce the first forms of that species, which then go on to reproduce in the normal way. C. Mackenzie Brown summarizes the process like this accurately. Quote, these matrix seeds seem to be of two types, a vitalistic seed that is responsible for life, and a designer seed that contains the information necessary for development when it interacts with DNA. In this way, Cremo concludes cell differentiation is explained by including the idea of intelligently guided genetic engineering. So basically, that is what I propose in this 11th chapter of human devolution. And as I said, it's one person's presentation. Similar ground was covered later by Richard Thompson, also known as Sadhu Prabhu, in his book, Maya, the World as Virtual Reality. And he went over the same kinds of paranormal evidence that is included in human devolution and comes to similar conclusions. And another very important contribution to this area of research and study and outreach is the book Hindu Theology and Biology, the Bhagavad Purana and Contemporary Theory by Jonathan B. Edelman, an Oxford-trained scholar who has written a wonderful, excellent account of these same types of issues, but being that he's a properly credentialed scholar in this area of science and religion studies and theology and biology, he's been able to introduce these concepts into the discourse of science and religion studies in a very effective way, I believe. So I think there are scholars active now who are connected in one way or other with the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies that have carried out with pretty much the same intention the kind of thing that I was trying to do with all my limitations in human devolution. But the work that I've done has continued to attract interest and the attention of scholars up to the present day. This book, Minority Report, Dissent and Diversity in Science, written by William T. Lynch, a science and technology studies scholar, and published in 2020, extensively discusses my work in connection with minority views in the world of science and academia. Now, this title, Minority Report, comes from a Hollywood film of that name starring Tom Cruise. It was based on a story written by Philip K. Dick, a science fiction author. In this film, the idea is that in the future, there's a police force that arrests people who are going to commit crimes in the future. And these personalities are identified by persons called precogs, people who have the ability to see what's going to happen in the future. And in any particular case, there has to be testimony from 3 of these precogs. And sometimes they all 3 agree, but sometimes one of the 3 will report something different about the person they're investigating, what they're going to do in the future. And the report of that one precog is given along with the opinions of the other two who are in the majority. So the report from the dissenting precog is called the minority report. So it often happens in the history of science that at a particular time, a minority view may not be accepted very widely, but sometimes the minority view becomes the mainstream view. So the problem that Lynch was dealing with in his book is how do you identify the minority group, the minority opinion that has the possibility, the potential to become the majority view. He doesn't think that just any minority view is worthy of further attention and among the members of a scientific discipline. What he says, and as I said, he was analyzing my work in these terms, says what matters more crucially is whether or not a case can be made that the early track record of an alternative approach has enough promise to demand further support at launching and carrying out a research program. While being aware of anomalies inherent to research programs is important, we should reject approaches. Okay, I have to, something's in the way here. I can't read that. Should reject approaches to social epistemology that use perspectivism to engage in anomaly mongering, unlikely to lead to new insights in the discipline under question. So, in his analysis of my work, and I don't necessarily agree with him, but he said my focus was too much on anomalies and not in providing a research program that could lead to new insights. And that was his analysis. So by perspectivism, he means adopting a perspective that encourages anomaly mongering, is what he calls it. So his point is that in any scientific research field, there are going to be anomalies, and pointing them out is not unimportant. But in addition to that, one should be able to propose a research program that may lead to new insights. So he goes on to say, constructivist scientific and technology studies, as well as philosophy of science, is split on whether it shares the materialism or physicalism of modern science, or sees that as an imposed and dispensable assumption. Now, that's an important observation because obviously, if we look at the Vedic cosmology from which we, myself and others, are trying to develop alternatives to the modern scientific approach, which is strictly materialist and physicalist in outlook, whether a minority that is in favor of some non-material or non-physicalist interpretation of the evidence, is a candidate for becoming a competitor in these different disciplines that are under the heading of materialism and physicalism. So I think his acknowledgement that even within the field of science studies, there are those who are questioning these commitments, these ontological commitments of modern science. I think that's an important observation. Now, the work that I've done and that others such as Sariputta and Jonathan Edelman have done is basically making an impact and getting noticed in science and religion studies, history and philosophy of science. But to make real progress, I think we have to start having some impact in the scientific field itself. And there's a whole new generation of scholars, academics, scientists who are associated with Bhaktivedanta Institute of Higher Studies, and they are beginning to make inroads in that area of consciousness studies and other related fields, cosmology and others. They're properly credentialed. They are making an impact already in a, we might say, a small way, but it's very historic. And the torch is being passed to this younger generation of scholars and scientists. So that brings me to the end of this presentation about the final chapter of human devolution and its impact and current relevance, and with a look towards the future, what needs to be done now to carry on this effort further in a more effective way. So these are some of my works. There's a special offer for 5 of them at the present time. So I'll end there. Thank you for your attention and open the floor for any comments or questions.
Thank you very much. Yes, does anyone have any comments, questions? You can just unmute yourself. True to Karma, what are you working on these days?
Well, I was working on these talks. I have a book that's in production now. It's a follow-up book to Forbidden Archaeology. It's called Extreme Human Antiquity. It should be out later this year. Everything's finished except an index and things like that. It just has to be typeset and proofread and cover made, and it'll be out. So basically, it's cases that came to my attention after the original book, Forbidden Archaeology, was published. So that's there. I'm always working on something.
Well, we're looking forward to your new book.
And yeah, of course, I'm part of the Vedic Planetarium Science Museum group. And we're continuing to work on developing exhibits for that project. So that's ongoing work that I'm involved in. So those are the kinds of things that are occupying my mind these days.
I have a question, if I might.
Sure.
Um, and again, thank you for this talk. You related to the Maya book, and of course, what's discussed in there, and we discuss, is areas of parapsychology. And I heard a talk recently by Hart from Notre Dame, who's a non-physicalist, and he said, gosh, I used to be the outlier and now I'm mainstream. What happened? I mean, things are changing. We saw it at the Tucson conference. There's some motion going on at the Noetic conference. We saw this, but there's always this delicate issue of dealing with the psi phenomena, because we can be labeled the woo-woo folks. And how do you deal with that?
I embrace it. But these things are coming from within the Western scientific community itself. So there's something that is still troubling the minds of intelligent people all over the world who are interested in these questions of the origin of life, the origin of the universe, the origin of species, the nature of reality. And it's a matter of ongoing discussion within these circles. And, Bill Lynch pointed that out. I gave one quote there where he said that in the field of science studies, maybe not the science fields themselves, but at least in the science field studies, there is disagreement about whether to honor the physicalist, materialist commitments of the different sciences, or is there room for non-physicalist, non-material approaches that would involve what is sometimes called the paranormal? So mainstream science does have some important contributions to make. The demand for some rigor in studies of these paranormal phenomena, like out-of-body experiences, psychokinesis, past life memories. So I think it's possible to make progress in these fields if the work is done according to a certain standard that is harder to raise objections to. And I think some of the members of the Bhaktivedanta Institute of Higher Studies are now involved in such work and are trying to do so in a way that responds to some of the concerns that have been raised by scientists about such work that's gone on in the past. So Um, Another way I approach it is to look at the history of science. For example, many of the heroes of modern science have been involved in such research, like Pierre and Marie Curie, for example,
Of course.
uh, Alfred Russel Wallace, and others. So that's another idea. Taking it to a deeper level, if you look at the history of the Royal Institution, I mean, the Royal Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society in England, they went through a period where they they were they were confronted about 500 or 600 years ago with a situation in which research into vital energies, subtle powers, and things of that sort were widespread in the scientific world. But they made a decision at a certain point to exclude that and focus on ordinary matter operating according to mathematically described laws from which you can make predictions. And and they successfully instituted that kind of discipline in the world of science, which is very productive because in that way they learned a great deal about ordinary matter and how to control it. They could develop technologies based on it, but all at a certain cost, at a cost of not having a complete picture of everything that's going on in this universe. So uh, that brings us to the anomalies. And again, I think the work by Bill Lynch in Minority Report is important. Identifying the anomalies and the shortcomings in the current dominant paradigm, which is physicalist and materialist, is important. But if there's going to be progress in these disciplines, something more than pointing out anomalies is necessary. And that means formulating new approaches that have the possibility of solving problems in these disciplines that are outstanding. And I think that is possible, and it's something I think a new generation of BIHS researchers is involved in at the present moment. And it may involve invoking new energies and new kinds of entities, which is something that mainstream scientists also engage in. For example, in astrophysics, they've introduced unobservable entities and energies such as dark matter and dark energy in order to explain what they actually observe. Because without invoking those things, they don't have any explanation for them. So I think the same approach is probably going to be necessary in terms of the paranormal anomalies and remote viewing, psychokinesis, past life memories, and out of body experiences and things like that. It may be possible to introduce into the scientific approach unobservables that have the potential for explaining these phenomena. Otherwise, they can simply remain anomalies, and somebody can take some other approach to either incorporate them into the materialist, physicalist worldview ultimately, or do something that I haven't even thought of yet.
Thank you. That really like the way you're putting it, except for the one part.
Which
Oh,
is,
the BI has to figure all this out now.
no, you don't have to.
I know, thanks. Yeah. No, well said. I should look at Lynch's work. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. This has been an enlightening and very interesting journey. Thank you for taking the time to go through it with us. There's so much more to discuss. I hope that you do come back to do more lectures with us. We'd really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I like to have it on record. Yeah, so future historians of science can refer to it. But I thank you for the opportunity to make these presentations. And I look forward to coming back after a brief hiatus to do some more.
Right, yeah, and we look forward to it. And thank you everyone for your presence, for your attention. I know sometimes it's difficult on a Saturday, especially as the summer starts to come in, but we're very grateful and we'll be with you again soon.